There is a very old piece of advice in golf that goes, never play a money match against a man with a sunburnt left hand and a brand new glove. It means he's been practicing in secret, and he's about to take your money. The man who made that kind of wisdom necessary was called Titanic Thompson, and he is, by a distance, the most successful golfer you have never heard of, because he made more money from golf in the 1930s and 40s than the leading professionals of the era, and he did it without ever entering a tournament. That was deliberate. He was asked, repeatedly, why he didn't turn professional, and his answer was always some version of the same thing. He couldn't afford the pay cut. This is the story of the money match world that existed alongside professional golf for most of the 20th century. A world with no scorecards, no galleries, and no record books, where the stakes were often larger than the prize funds of major championships, and where the best player didn't necessarily win because winning wasn't actually the game being played. And it's a story about how that world ruined people, including, in the end, the man who was best at it. Start with who he actually was, because the mythology is thick and the man underneath is more interesting. He was born Alvin Clarence Thomas in 1892 in the Ozarks, in genuine rural poverty, almost no formal schooling. His father left when he was an infant, and from a very young age, he showed two abilities that would define his entire life. The first was extraordinary physical coordination. He could throw things with unnatural accuracy. He was a superb shot. He picked up any game involving hand-eye skill almost immediately, and he practiced obsessively in private while pretending in public to be a novice. The second was a talent for reading people. He understood, apparently instinctively, what would make a man bet, how much a man could be pushed for, and crucially, how to lose in a way that made someone want to play again. He got the nickname Titanic sometime around the sinking of the ship, from a story about him sinking everyone he played. The name stuck, and he kept it, which tells you something about how he thought about publicity. Now, the thing that most people get wrong about him is that they picture a card sharp. He did play cards, and he was very good, but cards were never his main business. His business was the proposition bet. A proposition bet is a wager on a specific, arranged feat, usually something that sounds difficult or impossible, and the entire art is that the person offering it already knows the answer. The classic examples attributed to him are the ones that circulate in every gambling book. Betting that he could throw a key into a lock from across a room, having already practiced it thousands of times. Betting on how many watermelons were on the back of a passing truck, having counted them earlier. Wagering that he could drive a golf ball 500 yards, then taking the bet to a frozen lake in winter and letting the ball skid. The pattern is always the same. The mark thinks he's betting on chance or on Titanic's ability. He's actually betting against preparation he doesn't know about. And golf was the perfect vehicle for that, for reasons that are worth understanding, because they explain why golf produced this culture and other sports didn't. Golf has a handicap system. That's the whole thing. It's the only major sport with a formal, universally accepted mechanism for making unequal players compete on level terms, which means any two strangers can arrange a fair-looking contest in about 90 seconds. And a handicap is self-reported. That single fact created an entire economy. If you can control what other people believe your ability to be, you control the terms of every match you play. Which means the most valuable skill in money golf isn't striking the ball, it's managing your reputation. Titanic understood this better than anyone. He deliberately never entered professional tournaments, because a tournament produces a public record, and a public record fixes your handicap forever. The moment there's a scorecard with your name on it, the negotiation is over. So he stayed invisible on purpose. No record, no ranking, no reputation except the one he chose to give you on the first tee. And he was, by every account from people who saw him, genuinely excellent. Contemporaries who played tour golf assessed him as capable of competing at that level. Some said better. He hit it long, he putted beautifully under pressure, and crucially, he was completely unbothered by money, because he'd been playing for sums that mattered since he was a teenager.
Then there's the ambidexterity, which is the single most famous thing about him and the most economically important. Titanic was naturally right-handed, but had trained himself to play left-handed to a nearly equal standard, and the hustle built on that is beautiful in its simplicity. He'd play a man right-handed and beat him, but not by much. Take his money. Then, as the man is reaching for his wallet, offer him a chance to get it all back. Double or nothing, with Titanic playing left-handed. To the mark, that's a gift. This is a man voluntarily crippling himself. The odds look enormous. And then Titanic would play left-handed, which he'd practiced for years, and beat him again. That's not a trick, it's an investment. He spent years building a second golf swing, purely so that he'd have a credible-looking disadvantage to offer, because the whole business depends on the other man believing he has an edge. Which brings us to how these matches actually worked, and why the stakes were so much higher than professional golf. In the 1930s and 40s, the prize for winning a significant professional tournament might be a few $1,000s, and the winner had to beat a full field over 4 rounds to get it. Meanwhile, in a private money match, 2 men could put $10,000 or $20,000 on a single 18 holes, with side bets from spectators on top. The money came from wealthy amateurs, businessmen, oilmen, gamblers, men with far more money than golfing ability, and an unshakable belief in their own game. That's the natural resource this entire ecosystem mined, and there were rules to how you did it properly, which Titanic essentially wrote. Never win by too much. The margin matters more than the result, because a man beaten narrowly comes back next week, and a man humiliated does not. He'd frequently win on the last hole, having engineered the whole round to look close. Never let anyone know your real game. Play badly early. Miss a few putts on purpose. Establish the handicap you want before there's money involved. Take the bet at the right moment. Not when the mark is confident, but when he's slightly frustrated and wants to prove something. And know when to leave town. That last one matters, because this world had a hard edge that gets romanticized away. These were not friendly wagers among gentlemen. Titanic frequently carried a gun. He was, by his own admission, involved in situations where people died. He was a witness in the aftermath of the killing of the New York gambler Arnold Rothstein, one of the most notorious figures in American organized crime, after a card game. So when we talk about golf hustling, the picture should not be a jolly con man. The picture is a man traveling with cash, in a world of people who'd lost large sums to him, in an era with no law worth mentioning covering any of it. It's worth walking through how a match was actually assembled, because the golf was genuinely the smallest part of it. The first stage was finding the mark, and the marks were not random. They were men with 3 specific properties: money, obviously, but also a high opinion of their own game, and, most importantly, a social position that made backing down embarrassing. That third one is the engine. A man on his own can decline a bet with no cost. A man in front of his friends, his business partners, or his club, who has spent years telling everyone how good he is, cannot. So the hustle was often set up in company, deliberately, because the audience did half the work. The second stage was the introduction, and this is where the theatre started. Titanic would rarely propose a match himself. He'd be brought along by somebody else, often a local player he'd already arranged things with, and presented as a friend, a businessman, someone passing through who played a bit. He'd then play badly. Not comically badly, which is suspicious, but plausibly badly. A few loose drives, a 3-putt. He'd ask what a particular club was, or which way a putt broke, questions a decent player wouldn't need to ask. The third stage was letting the mark win. Small stakes first, and Titanic would lose, and pay up cheerfully. That's the crucial investment, and it's the part amateurs at hustling get wrong. Losing money on purpose is not generosity, it's advertising spend. It establishes both a false handicap and a pleasant impression, and it makes the mark want to play again for more. Then the stakes climb, usually over several sessions, and always at the mark's suggestion, because a man who proposes the stakes himself never suspects he's been led there.
And the final stage was the match that mattered, where the real game appeared for the first time, usually late in the round when the money was too big to walk away from. That whole sequence could take days, sometimes weeks. It was a con with a golf course as the venue, and the reason it kept working is that at every single step, the mark believed he was the one making the decisions. There's a second layer of the business that's less famous and probably made more money, which is that Titanic also acted as a backer. Backing means putting up the stake for another player and taking a share of the winnings. And it's an extremely good business if you can assess talent accurately, because your downside is capped at the stake, and your upside is a percentage of everything. So Titanic would find young players with real ability and no money, stake them into matches, and take a cut. He was, in effect, running a small investment fund in human talent. and he was reportedly excellent at it, because his whole life had been about assessing what people could actually do rather than what they claimed. And that's how a number of genuinely good players ended up in the money game rather than the professional one. Somebody offered to fund them immediately, in cash, for matches that paid this week, at an age when the alternative was several lean years grinding a tournament circuit for small purses, with travel costs coming out of their own pocket. Put like that, the choice most of them made was not stupid at all. It was the rational short-term decision, and it cost them everything long-term. Now, the part of this story that matters most, which is what the money match world did to actual golfers. Because Titanic didn't only play businessmen, he backed players, staked them, and matched them against each other. And a whole generation of extremely talented golfers made their living in that world rather than in tournaments. Because for a long stretch, the money genuinely was better. The problem is what that does to a career. A professional tour career compounds. You build a record, the record builds a reputation, the reputation brings sponsorship, teaching opportunities, club positions, and a life after competition. Every event you play adds to an asset. Money golf doesn't compound, it's transactional. You take $20,000 off a man on Tuesday, and on Wednesday you have $20,000 and nothing else. No record, no ranking, no sponsor, no pension. Your entire career is stored in cash, and cash gets spent, stolen, lost at cards, or taken back by the next hustler. And that's exactly what happened, over and over, to men who were good enough to have been champions. The gambling culture around it made it worse, because the people who were drawn to that life were, almost by definition, people who liked action. A man who wins $40,000 on a golf course and then sits down at a dice table with it is not going to keep the $40,000. Titanic himself lost enormous sums that way, repeatedly throughout his life. So you get a category of player who was, in pure ability terms, among the best in the world, and who ended with nothing. No trophies because they never entered, no money because it went, and no place in the sport's history because golf keeps its records in scorecards, and these men never handed one in. That's the actual tragedy in the hustling world, and it's collective rather than individual. An entire tier of talent that the sport simply has no record of. There's a specific mechanism worth naming here, because it explains why so few of these men got out with anything. Call it the ratchet. In tournament golf, a bad week costs you your entry fee and your expenses. That's it. You go home, you're poorer, you enter next week. The downside is bounded. In money golf, a bad day can cost you everything you have, plus whatever you can borrow at the 18th green. The downside is unbounded, and worse, it's unbounded at exactly the moment your judgment is worst, because you're losing and you want it back. So the distribution of outcomes is completely different. Tournament golf gives you many small losses and occasional large gains, which is survivable. Money golf gives you many small gains and occasional catastrophic losses, which is not, because you only need the catastrophe once. And the men in that world played it every week for decades. Statistically, the ruin was not a risk, it was a schedule. Add to that the second problem, which is that the skills don't transfer to anything.
A tournament professional who ages out has a career. He becomes a club professional, a coach, a commentator, a course designer, a representative for an equipment company. The record he built is a credential, and the credential converts into a job. A money player has no credential. He has stories. And when his game declines, or the marks dry up, or his reputation finally travels far enough that nobody will play him, he has no second act. Because everything he built was deliberately unverifiable. That's the trap at the center of the whole thing. The invisibility that made the money possible is precisely what leaves you with nothing when the money stops. There's one more group worth mentioning, because they're the least visible casualties of all. Throughout this era, there were superb black golfers in America who were barred from the PGA of America by an explicit clause restricting membership to Caucasians, which stood until 1961. For those players, the professional tour was simply not available, regardless of how good they were. So a number of them made their living in exactly the world we've been describing: exhibitions, money matches, and the parallel circuit that existed alongside the official one. Some were, by the accounts of people who played with them, capable of winning at the highest level, and there was no mechanism by which that could ever be tested. That adds a much darker layer to the phrase, golf has no record of them. For some of these men, staying out of the records was a choice about business. For others,
the exclusion was the point, and the money game was the only place left to play. It's worth holding both of those in mind, because they produce the same absence in the archive for completely different reasons. And the man at the center of it ended the same way. Titanic Thompson made, by most estimates, millions of dollars across his life, at a time when that was a genuinely enormous sum. He won it at golf, at cards, at dice, at proposition bets, and by all accounts, he never had a job. He also lost almost all of it. He gambled at everything, and the discipline that made him unbeatable when he was setting the terms deserted him when he wasn't. He backed himself in games he couldn't control. He was, in the end, exactly the kind of mark he'd spent a lifetime finding. His last years were quiet and reduced. He'd outlived the world he'd operated in. Professional golf had become properly organized. Prize money had grown enormously. Television had arrived, and the wealthy amateurs who'd funded everything had largely stopped playing five-figure matches with strangers. The ecosystem dried up. He died in 1974 in a nursing home, having reportedly spent his final period there playing cards with the staff for small change. It's worth asking whether this world still exists, because the answer is yes and no, and the difference is instructive. The high-stakes private match absolutely still happens. There are well-documented modern games at exclusive clubs where the sums involved are enormous, and there are still players who make a substantial living from arranged matches rather than tournaments. But the hustle in its classic form is largely finished, and the reason is information. Titanic's entire business model depended on a stranger not being able to find out who he was. In an era of no television, no databases, no phones in pockets, a man could genuinely arrive in a town where nobody had heard of him, and the only evidence available was what he showed you on the first 9 holes. That's gone. Now, anyone can be searched in seconds. Handicaps are held in national systems and are far harder to falsify. Tournament results, junior records, college golf, amateur rankings, all of it is public and indexed. So the specific edge, which was controlling what people believe about your ability, has largely evaporated. You can still be a better player than someone thinks. You can no longer be an unknown quantity. Which means the money match world survives as gambling between people who broadly know what each other can do, rather than as a con. That's a completely different activity, and considerably less lucrative for the person who is secretly excellent. There's a nice irony in that. The thing that finally ended the golf hustler wasn't law enforcement or the sport cleaning itself up. It was record keeping. So what's the actual lesson here, beyond the anecdotes? I think it's about what a sport chooses to record and what that does to the people inside it. Golf's entire prestige structure is built on tournaments. Majors, records, scorecards, trophies. That's the archive. And it's a good archive because it's objective and it's comparable across decades. But it only contains people who entered. For most of the 20th century, there was a parallel golf economy, where the money was often better and the competition was frequently just as strong. And none of it exists in the record. The men in it were, in many cases, deliberately staying out, because being recorded was bad for business, which produces a strange result. The best players of an era are, by definition, the ones who competed publicly. But the best player of an era might not be, because some of them were making a much better living by making sure nobody ever knew how good they were. Titanic Thompson spent 50 years ensuring that no reliable record of his ability would ever exist, and he succeeded completely. It made him rich, and it erased him. And the advice at the start of this holds up better than any of it. If a man turns up with a sunburnt left hand and a brand new glove and tells you he's not really much of a player and asks whether you'd like to make it interesting, he's already counted the watermelons.